Hello, we are coming back to the suspension talks, and this time with Stelarc. Is a performing artist where often involve robotics and other modern technology integrate with his body. Between 76 and 88, he has complete 26 body suspensions performance, and he took a long break from suspensions, and after in 2000, I believe 12, you start again with body suspensions.
Yes.
Thank you so much for being here, for accepting. I really appreciate. And for the suspension community, I got a lot of requests to make one interview with you because you did a lot for this community. You influence a lot of this new generation of body suspension facilitators. So thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, no, thanks very much, Beto.
Normally, I like to start with small, short questions, like for the people who don't know you, where are you from, where do you live? Then we will start with, since the beginning, how you start with suspension.
Yeah. Well, I was actually born in Cyprus, so my background is Greek Cypriot, but my parents emigrated to Australia. I grew up in Australia. You know, I have an Australian passport now. And but for 19 years, I also lived in Japan. So the early suspensions happened when I was living in Japan.
So, how was the first contact you had with body suspensions?
Well, you have to understand that I really didn't have any knowledge of modern suspensions. For example, I didn't know about Fakir Mustafa until after uh, the Obsolete Bodies book was published, and Fakir actually got in touch with me, sent me a letter. And I responded. So the context of my suspensions was the outcome of doing some sensory deprivation and physically difficult actions. So, for example, the performance I did just before the first suspension was for 1 week. I was in a Tokyo gallery. My lips and eyes were sewn shut with surgical needle and thread. My body was connected to the gallery wall with 2 hooks into my skin in the back. So for 1 week, I couldn't see, I couldn't speak, I couldn't drink, I couldn't eat, and I couldn't move very far from the wall of the gallery. So that was the performance just before the first suspension event. So the idea with the suspensions was to see the body as a kind of sculpture. And when I thought about suspending the body, I imagined the body as a kind of sculpture of stretched skin, where the stretched skin was a kind of indicative of the gravitational landscape, you know, of being suspended in a 1G gravitational field. On the other hand, I was familiar through some photographs in a book of Hindu Indian rituals. So when I saw these rituals of piercing the skin, I thought, whoa, this would be a really interesting way to suspend the body, because I did a series of earlier suspensions where I suspended my body using harnesses and rope. So the body was suspended, but it looked more like it was supported in space. So it wasn't very elegant, and it was very cluttered visually. So the idea of using hooks piercing the skin meant that with a minimum amount of support, you could suspend the body, and you didn't have any sort of visual clutter of a harness, or a lot of other paraphernalia. So when we did the first suspension event, for example, the people who helped me were an artist, a Japanese gardener who was used to suspending heavy rocks. And there was a photographer. There was no audience. So really the people who were there were just the people who were assisting me, 2 or 3 people, plus the photographer, plus the guy with the video camera. So we did it really without having any experience, without, I mean, I still haven't been to India. I still haven't been to any kind of country where I could see these traditional piercing sort of rituals. So yeah, we began with absolutely no support or knowledge. It was just my rudimentary knowledge of anatomy. So where would be a safe place to insert the hooks? How deep? I discovered, or I realized, that if you insert only into skin, you would have less bleeding if you avoided muscle, because muscle has a lot of blood capillaries, and you would have much more bleeding if you insert the hooks into muscle. So it was, done with the help of friends who were other artists, and also done with my rudimentary knowledge of anatomy. There was no one to ask, assistance to do these.
And where you got the hooks?
Well, there's a kind of a funny story connected to that, because I realized that I would need stainless steel hooks, which of course were sterilized. But I realized also that the easiest place to get these would be at a fishing store, right? And I would file the barbs, and I would sharpen the hooks in a kind of facet, with a facet. And there was no easy way to insert them. So, for example, 2 people were needed to insert one hook. One person to pinch the skin away from muscle, and the other person to push the hook, physically with 2 hands. So it required a lot of effort to make one insertion. It usually took us about 45 minutes to an hour to insert 18 hooks, which was typically the number I used. I used also less. But at that time, I thought that if I could distribute the weight of the body, then, more hooks would be better than fewer hooks. Of course, it's possible to be suspended by 2 hooks or even 1 hook, but at the time we really didn't know what we were doing, and I didn't know fully. In fact, the first attempted suspension performance was in Adelaide in Australia in 1975 at the Experimental Art Foundation. But the media found out about what I was going to do, and they created such hysteria that this guy was going to suspend himself, was going to possibly self damage or even commit suicide from this suspension, and it was so dangerous. And the Experimental Art Foundation stopped the performance 30 minutes before it was going to happen. We were already sterilizing the hooks. We had created a kind of a landscape of large rocks in the gallery space. We had already constructed the support to hang the body from, because we couldn't really hang it from the ceiling. And 30 minutes before the suspension event, the Experimental Art Foundation pulled out. They decided they couldn't support this performance any longer. So, you know, when I did the first suspension in Japan the following year, there was no audience, there was no publicity. We just did it quietly. In fact, most of the 26, 27 early suspensions were done either in private gallery spaces or in remote locations where there was no invited audience.
Yeah, because we need to figure out or need to put in mind, it was in the 76. So that was like, not like today where all the media was in some point talking about body suspension. That was something really underground and nobody knows.
Yeah. And, you know, it was, I mean, for example, in Tokyo, security guards stopped one suspension. We were going to connect two buildings, the roof of two buildings with a cable, and I was going to kind of slide from one building to another. And we got partway through our preparations, and security guards spotted us and stopped it. They wouldn't allow us to continue. And of course, in New York, you know, what was meant to be a 30-minute suspension performance was only 12 minutes because the police arrived, and we had locked the downstairs doors of the building. This was 4 stories up. Unfortunately, they stopped the performance only after 12 minutes. And I was arrested. Well, you know, all of these suspensions of mine were done naked. You know, I was not wearing any clothing. So when in New York, it was interesting because why was I arrested? Not for a display of public nudity, not for some, you know, sadomasochistic action in public. No, I was arrested for being a danger to the public. If I had fallen on someone, this would have been a problem. Not so much for me, but maybe for the person I landed on.
Be a little bit more soft.
Yeah.
Was a reason why you was doing the suspension always naked?
Well, you know, at that time, to me, it didn't seem logical if I was inserting, you know, 18 hooks into my body, sometimes in the front, sometimes in the back, sometimes on both sides. It was kind of crazy to think of wearing any clothing. And also, you know, I saw the body as this, sculpture of stretched skin. So I wanted to have this relationship of the body, you know, the stretched skin, the tension of the cables. So wearing clothing was a kind of additional decoration that was not needed.
Yeah. have sense. And so you did the first suspension in Maki Gallery in Tokyo, Japan, right?
Yes, yes. Yeah.
So, and what I saw in the first four suspensions, you was changing positions because you started in horizontal with face down, and then you went to the vertical, and then to in the third one horizontal, face up, and then you get with head down.
And then upside down.
So that was like
Yeah.
360 degrees rotation. Uh, was
Yeah.
something to do with like see the world in different perspective, or why you did this rotation?
Yeah, I was quite honestly only ever thinking of doing one suspension. I didn't imagine that I was going to do a whole series of different performances. But after I did the first suspension, um, yeah, it generated additional ideas. Uh, the first one was horizontal face down. What about vertical? Uh, what about horizontal face up? What about upside down? And then these were kind of static suspensions, but then also what about swinging the body? What about spinning the body? Um, so, and of course, later on, using a crane, a gantry crane and then with a control box, I could hoist my body uh, myself. So I could choreograph the movements of the body through the space. So it wasn't only an up and down performance, but I could propel my body in different directions. And typically those performances began when the body was hoisted off the ground, and the performance ended when the body touched down again. That was the general kind of idea. So one performance generated a series of bodily orientations, and then site-specific suspensions, and then more structural suspensions, and then some very high ones. Like New York was only 4 stories high, but Copenhagen was 60 meters high. And, there were no safety nets, there were but by then I was confident that my skin would hold, and the hooks would be secure enough. But after about 30 meters above the buildings, um, and as I got approaching the 60 meters high, all I could hear was the whooshing of the wind, the whirring of the crane motors, and the creaking of the skin. So in New York you could still hear the traffic sounds below. You could hear the cars beeping their horns and people yelling and stuff like that. In Copenhagen, after 30 meters, you couldn't hear anything at street level. You were in this kind of more abstract space of different sounds, um, and also what wasn't apparent even in the video documentation was that the body was actually all of the body was vibrating from the wind. Above the buildings, you weren't protected from the wind, and there was a fairly windy afternoon, and the whole body was vibrating in addition to rotating on its axis, in addition to being spun around by the crane. So it was, I thought of this performance as a kind of choreography of the body in the space, using a large machine, in this case, a crane.
And how you got the crane?
With great difficulty. Well, the problem, well, um, this performance was part of a festival. So I had some kind of official support for this performance. But of course, the organizers were very concerned for safety reasons and for their responsibility. Um, and also, we had to convince the union to allow two crane drivers to operate the crane, because this was a very, very high, very large crane. And, yeah, we had to convince the union to allow these two guys to operate it. And it wasn't easy. And then really this was the major public performance, because it was estimated that about 10,000 people watched this performance from down below, and it was also shown on TV. I mean, it was very, very different to all of the previous ones, but it wasn't a kind of a deliberate decision by me to do a public performance, but because it was part of a festival, they wanted it to be very public. And originally, actually, originally, I was supposed to be suspended by a helium balloon.
Wow.
But several days before the performance, the guys who had the balloon pulled out. They decided they didn't want to participate. And then all of a sudden, I didn't have a performance, and I still wanted to be suspended in some way. And then when I was walking back to the hotel, I noticed this really large crane, and it was turning around, and I thought, wow, it would be really interesting if I could suspend my body. But to get permission was not easy. And then in New York, I was arrested. In Copenhagen, the police controlled the traffic. This was in, I think, 1985. So in 1985, there was a public performance, a nude, an artist who's completely naked, suspended by hooks, 60 meters above the city.
Wow, that's super nice. And about the New York, you don't have permission, of course, not to do this
No.
this action.
Yeah.
Uh, where you got the people to help you? In all the
Yeah.
technical part to get the gear, to make the frames, to put the hooks.
Yeah. Well, firstly, yeah, no, it's a good question. But I had a connection with a gallery in East Village. This was 1984, I think. It was called the Mo David Gallery. And so I convinced them that this would be an interesting performance to do. And so they found, a, you know, a site. This was East 11th Street in New York, where they could access one building that had an empty room on the fourth floor. So we were able to do the initial rigging and insertions in private on the fourth floor of one building. And then when I was ready, we lowered the steel cable to the ground below. One of my assistants picked up the cable, ran across the street, up the fire escape stairs, and then tethered the cable to the fire escape stairs. And so when everything was ready, my body kind of slid out of the window, and it stopped about halfway across the street, because the cable, of course, was tense, but it wasn't so tense that I could just simply slide across. My weight stopped me about halfway across, and I knew that this was the plan. Um, and so, but the plan was for at least a 30-minute performance, but the police stopped it after 12 minutes.
And you have like a safety line to put you back?
There was well, it wasn't so much a safety line, but there was another line to uh, pull me back. Um, but yeah, that safety line became a problem after the performance ended, because someone dropped it, and as a van drove past, the safety cable got tangled in the side mirror, and fortunately, one of my assistants at street level was able to stop the van and release the cable. So we had a little melodramatic ending to the performance. It was also the other kind of melodrama was that the corner of East 11th Street was a kind of a drug dealing area, and the drug dealers didn't like the attention that was being given to this area, and they were throwing sort of stuff at me whilst I was suspended.
Yeah, but it's always is good when you have like a huge crew to support, and to avoid
Well,
this.
it wasn't. It's only like 5 or 6 people at the most, and they were doing the insertions for the first time. Basically, I instructed them. Using a felt pen, I would mark the positions on my body, and I would instruct them the day before. Pinch the skin. The second person does the insertion. It was not so easy to insert the hook physically in that way. And as I said, it took 45 minutes to an hour to do these insertions. I did get the assistance of someone to weld the support structure for the body, a kind of flying fox, so I could slide out of the building, over the street. So there was some planning and preparation, but in every suspension event outside of Japan, it was never the same people who assisted me. It was always someone different. And like, for example, in Los Angeles, one person who had agreed to do the insertions, he was actually a medical student, the day before decided to pull out. So all of a sudden I had to find someone else who would agree to do it. And in Germany, for example, with the upside down suspension, there was a friend who was a poet who had agreed to do the insertions. But when he came, he was kind of a little drunk. So we had to find a last minute replacement.
Oh, nice. Um, so you was shaping the hooks to make it sharp.
Yes.
You can pierce with them, no?
Yes. Yeah, it's not like now, um, where you can do it more easily with a kind of hollow needle.
Yeah. Yeah, good. We have this technology now, make more easy, no? But
Yeah, it's
like the most of the places I went to the Taipusan Festival or in Phuket Festival or the Cap Gomeh in Malaysia, and they pierce the hooks just straight with the hook, no? Like
yeah,
it's
yeah,
kind of like the tradition, no? Like they don't
yes.
have they don't use the normal blade needles, no?
No,
So
no.
in some way, you keep the tradition, the old tradition.
Yeah, well, it wasn't so much keeping a tradition, rather, doing it in what I thought at the time was the only logical, the only possible way to do it.
Mm.
I didn't study Hindu Indian rituals I mean, you have to imagine that these performances were done in the context of an art practice. So this was not about any kind of initiation. This was not about any kind of sort of uh, exhibiting yogic control or some kind of shamanistic prowess. It wasn't done as a kind of ritual. It was done simply considering the body as as an object, not as an object of desire, but rather an object that you could reconfigure, that you could redesign, that you could modify, that you could treat it as a kind of material. So that was the kind of attitude with these performances.
And what I understood watching the your book, the most of the suspensions in the beginning, the first like 5 or 6 suspensions, you never used like a pulley system.
Yes,
It was more like a static suspensions where you have like a wood frame and then you was hanging.
yes,
Is one
yes.
suspension where you are sitting with several hooks on the chest and the back and on the legs and also on the side on the ribs. But then you have a pulley system. How you got the idea
Yes.
to use it?
Well, I wanted to do you're right, the first suspensions were kind of static suspensions, but I wanted to do a suspension where I could hoist myself up. Instead of other people suspending me, I wanted to suspend myself. And so, of course, I needed people to insert the hooks, but I wanted to pull myself up. So this performance was titled uh, "Pull Up, Pull Out," because as I was pulling the body up, the skin was stretching outwards, and uh, for this though we needed a 4-to-1 pulley ratio system. So the interesting thing was that I was pulling 68 kilograms, but I was doing it easily because we were using a 4-to-1 pulley structure. So that was kind of um, the first performance where uh, I kind of suspended myself in a way, you know.
And also is one suspension I really like it. I like the concept. Is they call the clone suspension. Can you tell me about it?
Yeah, I mean, the the clone suspension was, I mean, typically the suspension performances, lasted, half an hour or maximum an hour. I mean, for me at the time, there was no desire to have a very, very long durational suspension. The time was determined by the process. So, or for some unexpected situation. So, for example, with the rock suspension, where my body was counterbalanced by the ring of rocks, um, I decided to end the suspension when the telephone rang in the gallery. It was a sort of strange moment where, having been suspended and counterbalanced by a ring of rocks, and then I was gently swaying, setting up random oscillations in the rocks. It was, I guess, kind of meditative. Um, but then when the telephone rang, uh, yes, so I decided, well, that this was an appropriate time to finish it. Or with the Copenhagen suspension, it took about 30 minutes to rotate the body with the crane 3 times before it was lowered down. So the organizers of that performance were really worried about the safety of what I was doing. And so they said, no, 3 rotations should be enough, and then you should come down. And that took about 30 minutes, you know. So the time was, you know, determined by the process. I never attempted to be suspended for a kind of an indefinite period of time. So I've never really experienced, you know, a 2 or 3 hour suspension, for example. So that's the kind of attitude that I had in these suspension events and the duration of the suspensions.
You say about the time to you was feeling kind of dizzy or afraid of what you was doing?
Well, I was, you know, my attitude in all of my performances, whether they're the suspension events or the high tech performances, or like being connected, for example, at the end of an industrial robot arm, is not a particularly safe thing to do. But we could precisely program, you know, the position orientation, the velocity, and the trajectory of the body. But forgetting that performance, you know, there was uh, an attitude of indifference. That's how I characterize all of my performances. Uh, by indifference, I mean um, the opposite to having any expectations. You allow the performance to happen in its own way, in its own time, with its own rhythm. Of course, you plan the performance, but it's not kind of scripted, you know. So uh, you need to trust the people who are assisting you, even though they have no experience with what they're doing, and you have to take, though, the physical consequences for these actions. So, as a performance artist, you have an idea, but what's important is to actualize the idea. And when you actualize the idea, there are physical difficulties, there are physical consequences. I've never had medical treatment or any kind of serious accident with any of these suspensions. Um, I guess the most difficult performance was when I inserted a sculpture inside my stomach. And inside the stomach, the sculpture opens and closes, extends and retracts, has a flashing light and a beeping sound. but this, you know, I needed medical assistance to do this safely, and the endoscopist decided to stop helping me after 2 days of inserting the sculpture, because we were scraping my esophagus, and you know, there was some bleeding, and so, you know, but that was, you know, probably the most dangerous medically of all of the suspension. You know, there were no suspension performances that required any treatment, you know. So
And it's was a performance you was doing in Mexico in the Museo Universitario, called
uh,
Penetration Extrapolation. Can you tell me about it? I'm really like that one.
oh, this was, Yeah.
It's nothing to do
Well,
with.
this was actually a pretty dangerous action because uh, you just couldn't anticipate what was going to happen. That particular performance was again before the first suspension event, where I ran through a sheet of glass, and this was 5 millimeter plate glass. It wasn't like shatterproof glass or anything like that. It was plate glass. And, I asked my friend who was a physicist, how far I should run and how fast I should run to be able to break the glass, because it would have been embarrassing if I simply hit the glass and nothing happened, right? And his advice was, well, you had to run at least 50 meters as fast as you could, and then keep going. So I had to imagine passing through the glass, and I was very lucky. As I hit the glass, I could remember the glass shattering away from me. I remember thinking I should not land on the glass, which was landing in front of me. And fortunately, I didn't land directly on any shard of glass, but I did actually cut my my leg, my ankle, and my lower leg, and I needed I forget about 15 stitches um, afterwards to kind of to seal the wound. But yeah, it was this idea of penetrating a material substance. And interestingly, the photographer who was supposed to document this performance he arrived late, but fortunately he got one photograph at the time when my body had just broken the glass and was kind of passing through it. So yeah, but that was an early performance that was possibly also very dangerous because, yeah, it could have been, I could have cut my body more seriously than what I did.
Also in the 91 in Mexico, you did I believe it's a beautiful performance in the university, in the UNAM, in the Espacio Escultórico, what is a lava rock surface of swimming pool. And it's amazing location, but if we think about what happened in Mexico in that time was a lot of repression against the students.
Yeah.
The political situation in Mexico was really bad in that time.
Yes. Yeah.
Repression. How you got this space, man, to do suspension in the middle of the university when this crazy situation was living?
Yes. I knew an artist in Mexico who uh, who was, I think, the director of the museum there, Helen Escovedo, and I saw the this sculpture space site, and I thought this would be a very beautiful performance if I could be suspended in this kind of circular space of of lava, that had solidified. And then, of course, around this space, there were these kind of monolith structures. And I thought spinning my body in this space was going to be interesting because when my body was spinning fast, these individual structures blurred into one kind of optical field. And then as I slowed down, so it was a kind of flicker effect, you know. But the problem with Mexican performance was it was done in summer and I got sunburnt. So that was the problem with that performance.
And how was the reaction of the people over there?
Well, again, you know, there was only a limited number of people who knew about the performance. Maybe 20 or 30 people. I don't remember the number. And yeah, I mean, it's very difficult to know their actual response. I mean, I was just determined to do a suspension performance in this beautiful site, in this beautiful location, which was kind of very primal, but also had this kind of architectural structure defining it. So, yeah, I mean, sometimes it was very difficult to organize a performance. Sometimes it was done completely in private, so there was no problem, you know.